Hello and welcome to the Temple Mount podcast. I am Shogun. We have a very special episode because joining me today for the second time on my podcast is my father, Hawthorne Waxwing. And as with the first episode I did with him, which has been posted on the general chat of the Temple Mount server, and I hope you'll listen to it. It's actually one of our most popular podcasts in terms of views and likes. We're going to talk about the Oak Island mystery, sometimes called the Oak Island Money Pit, sometimes called the Curse of Oak Island or the Oak Island Mystery. It's a whole topic about this island in Canada and all these strange and interesting aspects of it. And today we're going to pick up where we left off and get into the new discoveries and the new ramifications and theories about what's going on with Oak Island and how it may or may not tie into other topics we've covered, like the Phoenicians and the Jesus the Phoenician episode, or the Knights Templar in the Knights Templar episode on the Temple Mount podcast, which you can find in the Temple Mount podcast channel of the Temple Mount Discord server. That being said, welcome, Hawthorne. How are you, my friend, my sir, my father? How are you?
I'm very well, thank you, and I'm excited to have this opportunity. I've been giving it a lot of thought, and I'm expecting that we're going to cover some ground that nobody's ever really gone into before. So I'm looking forward to that. And please be sure before we conclude to remind me to come back to this idea about the connection between Oak Island and Armageddon and the ultimate spiritual event, if you will, of determination, if you know what I mean.
Absolutely.
And that's not. Hi everybody, thanks for being here. I am Shogun's father, and I have had a lifelong interest in Oak Island in Canada's eastern, I think not quite easternmost province of Nova Scotia. Our family history goes back there to the year 1745, and I'll bring that up again towards the end when I think we can connect Shogun's essential bloodline to something very close to the Knights Templar. So that I wasn't actually anticipating, but I can show you the book. And also, so we did a show 2 years ago in which we explored what was known as of 2020, I guess, about the state of discovery from the work that's ongoing on the island. As some of you might know, the History Channel's most popular program is called The Curse of Oak Island, and it's essentially a live or like year-by-year account of a search for a treasure that has been the search has been going on since the year 1795. So the previous podcast that Shogun and I did a couple years ago, I used the year 1795 as the divide. That is, there's everything from 1795 until now is 225 years of people searching for what is hidden there. And a whole bunch of things happened before 1795, which is what you would call depositor activity. That is, people who were putting the treasure in the ground that we've been looking for 225 years. But there are some really interesting developments in the last 2 years. So if you're curious about this at all, I'd suggest watch our first episode, because I don't want to recover all of that stuff, fascinating as it is. But I'd rather sort of go into what have we learned in the last 2 years that isn't in common parlance, and what does it tell us about who the hell put this there? Because that's a question that's been on my mind since I was 9 years old, literally. In 1966, the Reader's Digest ran a book-length feature about the search for treasure on Oak Island, and at that time, when I read that as a 9-year-old. The dominant theory, in fact, the conclusion was that it was Captain Kidd's treasure. The pirate buried it, and that it was like Spanish gold that he captured. Well, that's kind of fallen by the wayside, because what's really clear now is that the complexity of the work that was done in Oak Island required a huge workforce for years and a really complex supply chain in order to support the infrastructure to hide something, and we still don't know what that is or who did it. And that was the piece that I kind of emphasized before, was that like, since I was 9 years old, I've wondered who the hell did this and what were they hiding. And all these years later, we still don't even have a leading hypothesis on the answer to either of those two questions. But what I'll do tonight is basically advance the thesis, which is also dominant in the History Channel series, which you can watch anytime. I might have to get the dog. It's on every week in the States on Tuesdays, and it always streams on the internet within 24 hours. So you can watch it week by week and actually see what they're discovering week by week. But the dominant hypothesis in season 9 of the program is that it was indeed the Knights Templar who buried the sacred, that is, a treasure much more valuable than silver and gold itself could possibly warrant, must be what is there. So these are cultural artifacts, not bullion, if you will, not coins. It doesn't make any sense to even consider this level of complex architecture and booby trapping and complexity, like just to bury gold and silver. Like, pirates would just run on shore, dig a fucking hole and throw the stuff in and make a map and run away. So, for example, I'll give some specifics. Actually, the one thing I wanted to mention that we also mentioned in the last podcast is the number one, and I posted this in general chat, that article that says the Templar Cross that was found in Smith's Cove 2 years ago is the most significant archaeological artifact in North American history. So think about that for a minute. Oh, wait, while I get the dog. Sorry.
Yeah, take your time.
Okay.
That's trippy. It's
Good
just some associations with that, right? But they made this ridiculously complicated series of trapped, incredibly deep excavations to hide something. And maybe they were trying to keep something, not treasure per se, but something dangerous that they didn't want anyone to find, right? In the sense that today
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
Potentially. Could be a demon or something, right? Could be like fucking Dracula or the keys to the apocalypse. Oh, we can't hear you, Hawthorne. Sorry. Or at least I can't. Hawthorne? I can't hear you. Can you guys hear me?
No.
Yeah, your audio is out, Dad. So try muting yourself, unmuting yourself, leaving the room, coming back. All right, he didn't seem to be able to hear or.
I don't think he can hear you.
No, he can't, but why not? Okay, I'm going to disconnect him, and then he'll hopefully rejoin and be fixed. Yeah, sorry, Hawthorne. We couldn't hear you, and you couldn't hear us. Can you hear us now?
I dropped out inexplicably. It might have been because I had that incoming call. So
No worries.
Sorry.
Welcome back.
Okay. Yeah, so I'm just going to try and highlight a few really interesting things that have happened in the last 2 years that I think strengthen the hypothesis that it was indeed the Knights Templar who hid this treasure on Oak Island. And the first thing I'm going to say is one thing we didn't know until this season 9 of the television series, is that the treasure is still there. A lot of people have speculated that somebody buried a treasure and then they dug it up, and now you're mucking around in there, but the treasure's already gone. So they've dug all these deep holes, 150 feet underground on an island that's only 33 feet high. So they're going like 120 feet below ocean level and finding human construction there. So that's like a 10 to 12-story building underground. So why would you do that using hand-hewn wood in such a hostile environment, just to hide coins? Where was I going with that? Damn, I lost my train of thought.
I mean, just for anyone who missed the first one or isn't familiar with Oak Island, there's an island in Canada called Oak Island. There's an incredibly complicated and deep excavation there, with many, many layers of traps and scaffolds, and they've been digging. And, what you brought up today really kind of tripped me out. It's just a thought experiment, right? But imagine, like I said, they weren't trying to store treasure, because if it was treasure, they would have wanted to have the reasonable ability to recover it quickly themselves if they needed it. It seems to me that what they buried there, they didn't ever intend to get back. They put all that effort essentially into making sure not only that no one else would get it, but that nobody would ever get it, right?
Unless you had the secret instructions on how you could recover it.
Well, I keep thinking if this pit is so difficult and full of traps, then obviously there's a side tunnel somewhere else that bypasses it entirely. And the stupidest thing, they can keep digging down and down and down when they already know that someone anticipated that and rigged a whole bunch of traps. So obviously there must be a side access somewhere.
Okay, so let me give you a quick, I put a couple diagrams in the general chat about how it was constructed, but here's a quick summary. It was discovered in 1795 by 3 young men who were paddling around, and they found a block and tackle hanging off of an old oak tree over a depression in the ground. And when they dug down, they found flagstones. And when they lifted them up and dug down, they found a layer of oak logs. And every 10 feet, they found oak logs. And eventually, the pit became over 100 feet deep. And they kept finding not only layers of oak logs, but also a stone tablet with a mysterious, like, runic inscription on it. And then when they removed that stone and went to the next level, the whole tunnel flooded up to ocean level. And they've never been able to get down to find out what warranted this elaborate booby-trapped construction. And so here are a couple of new things that I'm going to emphasize that strengthen the Templar connection. Right. The one I wanted to start with was the lead cross that they found on the beach in Smith's Cove. Now, Smith's Cove has been excavated, and it has all of this really elaborate underwater infrastructure, including concrete cribbing, which we discussed in the last episode, which no one has any explanation for. But on that beach, they found a lead cross, a Templar-style cross, and it was dated between 900 and 1400 AD. And the lead used in the construction of the cross had been mined in a mine in France that closed in the 1400s. So also, and this is one of the really serendipitous aspects of the show that I find quite fascinating, that is, I don't actually believe they could have scripted this. The lead character, the Lagina brother, I think it's Rick, goes to Europe to a castle in Dome, France, and he looks at, and I posted this in the general chat, these carvings that Knights Templar made in the walls of the castle and dome when they were imprisoned prior to their torture and execution. And they made carvings in the wall using apparently their own teeth. That doesn't sound like fun. And one of the carving that I posted there is absolutely identical to the lead cross that they pulled out of the beach in Smith's Cove, Oak Island, Nova Scotia, like literally weeks later. And you can watch the episodes, and I don't think you can fake that shit. So, and the lead cross that they found that I'm using as my icon tonight, or avatar, and the one that was carved in the wall of the prison cell in Dome, France, that held the Knights Templar, they look to me identical. So I don't know how you explain that, but the lead was from a mine that closed in the 14th century in France. So it really suggests that there were people of piety, if you will, that were involved in the original placement of the treasure that's in Oak Island. And that helps me understand why people would go to so much trouble to create such an incredibly elaborate engineering infrastructure to protect a treasure that was merely made up of Spanish pieces of 8 or gold bars. You don't need to do that unless it's something sacred. So why would the Knights Templar have anything of such value? Well, of course, as you explored in the episode about the Knights Templar, Shogun, they were put in charge of the Temple Mount when it was captured for the Muslims in the 1100s, and they had its full custody of it, I think, for a couple hundred years, right, before the Muslims pushed them back out. And during those years, that was their headquarters, and they were the military police who made sure that pilgrims didn't get ripped off, and they, as you said earlier, allowed people to deposit their money with them and then withdraw it when they got to Jerusalem so they wouldn't get whacked and robbed along the way. So they became the original bankers. And that made them people of incredible wealth and power, even though individually they took vows of poverty. So when you think about their eventual excommunication in 1307, right, Friday, October the 13th, they were an international military organization that was incredibly wealthy, so they had to have sources. And in those days, in order for the king, who was their debtor, to whack them all in a military operation so that he could write off his own debt, which is what he did, there had to be leaks. There had to be people who would tip them off, right? They were a well-resourced military intelligence organization. So I can't believe that there were no breaks between the local militia and the Knights Templar, who were in fortresses in those communities throughout Europe. So what I would have expected would have been that they had a fleet and they had ports. In fact, the country of Portugal is named after the port of the Grail, and it was essentially a Templar empire or kingdom. And so from either there or from the port in France, the Templars, having had some notice of their excommunication and impending arrest, would have taken the steps of protecting their most sacred relics. What would those be? Well, that would have been obviously what they got when they occupied the Temple Mount and had the opportunity to explore its subterranean infrastructure and allegedly find the place where the Ark of the Covenant and the Golden Menorah and the Spear of Destiny and the Holy Grail might be kept. those things, of course, would be the things that they would want to evacuate when people bent on their destruction were closing in on them. So their fleet disappeared from France or Spain. And the theory then is that they went to Scotland. The writer of the book on the subject, that's Randall Sullivan, he doubts that the Templars had a fleet worthy of crossing the ocean, but they definitely had a fleet worthy of getting to Scotland. It's just around the corner. So something about 18 ships left before they were captured by the French king, who owed them money. And they would have fled with their good stuff, and they would have taken it to Scotland. And then from Scotland, where would it go? Well, it would need to go to a safe place in the New World. And of course, Nova Scotia, the Canadian province of Nova Scotia, is the Latin for New Scotland. And that goes back to Henry Sinclair, who is understood to have made contact with the Mi'kmaq people of Nova Scotia, the First Nations people, in the late 1300s, such that their flag is the same. The Mi'kmaq of First Nations people of Nova Scotia, their war banner is the Scottish Templar flag. And they say that their songs sound like Scottish sea shanties that they learned from the sailors. Some of their songs. So there's this Scotland to Nova Scotia connection then. And Oak Island is in Mahone Bay, just south of Halifax, Nova Scotia. So there's a very plausible route of transit and motive and the means of transport. There was certainly, at that time, the technology to ship cargo from Europe to North America. In fact, if you look at the oldest proven settlement in North America, it's called Lance o' Meadows in Newfoundland. And it's a Viking settlement right on the north end of Newfoundland Island. But I think UNESCO acknowledges it goes back to about 900 AD. So the Templars were established in 1100, and they were excommunicated in 1307. They had unbelievable wealth. So even though they weren't they probably became sort of fat warriors in the sense that after a few generations of wealth, but they knew how to hire mercenaries, and they would know how to hire ships, and they would know how to hire people who can build tunnels.
Well,
so
I
think they had the ability to do what they did in Nova Scotia.
Mm-hmm. I was just going to say the Knights Templar, only about 10% of their order were knights in the sense of being warriors, and the other 90% were like everything from clerks to servants, and so they had this whole sort of caste of people who served them in a non-combat role, but there was about 10% of them who were actual heavy cavalry, and that was the military core, and then the rest of it was this whole empire, like you're saying. But that's really good. Really interesting background in addition to what we already covered. Was there anything else you wanted to get into? Should we open it up for questions? What do you think?
I've got a few other things I wanted to mention, if you don't mind.
Absolutely.
Okay, so I mentioned the Templar Cross, which dates between 900 and 1400 AD, found on the beach at Smith's Cove. Also that so this year they've used this new technology where they take water samples from these boreholes that they've drilled, and they found very high concentrations of ionic silver and gold, which shows that the water in those boreholes is in proximity to very high concentrations of silver and gold. So, and when they asked about, like, sort of jokingly, how much, and they used the term a Gerhardt dump truck. And if you've ever watched the Oak Island show, the guy who runs the heavy equipment, his name is Gerhardt. He's a truckload in himself. Like he's a big fellow. And so they said by Gerhardt dump truck, they mean that like there are huge quantities of gold and silver down there based on the ionic concentration that's evident only in a small cluster of boreholes. So these are 6-inch boreholes that they've been putting down to figure out where to do what is going to be their penultimate feat of the current season, which is going from 6-inch to 10-foot wide canisters that they're going to run down 160 feet into the ground, and they're going to bring everything up that's within like your whole living room and examine it on the surface to find out what the hell is down there that's leading to these concentrations of silver and gold. So that is in the current season that's unfolding week by week. That's the next phase of their work. They've been doing these exploratory holes to decide where they're putting down up to 4 10-foot wide canisters. And I personally don't believe they'll come up empty by putting down 1, 2, 3, or 4 of these canisters. They're going to come up with some answers, some serious shit. Because they know where they're going. And they've been bringing up this ancient wood. And this is also the first year in which they've actually ever brought up trace elements of metals or chunks of metal with embedded silver and gold in the metal itself at depth. So that suggests treasure chest, if you will. That is, they're bringing up pieces of metal that have surface flakes of silver and gold on them, and they're lead tin alloys coming up in these like big grinders that they send down. So I'm fascinated by that. First year that they've actually found gold at depth. Another thing is they're finding that in the swamp that's in the middle, this triangular swamp in the middle of the island, has many remains of an abandoned ship or a burnt ship, as if someone brought a ship into this cove, emptied it, and burned it. And they're finding small artifacts, but many of them that give evidence to prove that point. And another one is that in that same swamp, they found that there's not only like a wharf or a dock, but there's a road made out of stone. And if you go to the photo I put in the general chat about that, it's like a big freaking stone road. Right on the edge of the ocean, right on the edge of the swamp, where there's evidence that they brought a boat in and burned it. Like they hid it there, and then they closed it off to hide it so that it would always remain underwater. So the swamp itself, triangular shaped swamp, is an artificial construction intentionally designed to hide the remains of a ship that they unloaded there. Now, the other thing that they found is a whole bunch of ox shoes. So now we've got and extended pathways that go off of this wharf in 2 different directions, one of them towards the money pit. So, and it's not just like 1 or 2 ox shoes. They found like 10 or 12 of these things, different sizes of ox shoes. And why you only have ox shoes if you've got ox? Why would you have oxen? So now you've got a wharf and roads and draft animals and wagons hauling stuff. You don't do that if you're pirates that are just like trying to hide some treasure and get out of town. This is infrastructure. And this is really baffling because this is new since we did the last podcast. We briefly referenced it. But this is the only place in North America that this kind of infrastructure exists. There isn't anywhere else where you can see a sort of a European style medieval cobblestone roadway, like Roman style. It just does not exist in North American archaeology except on Oak Island. And if you want to argue about whether you believe it's a road or not, how would you explain ox shoes cast off all over the, like several of them on this stretch between the swamp and the money pit, if you didn't have fucking oxen? That's the only way they get there, and they're not supposed to fall off. So if you found a dozen of them, there's a lot of oxen going back and forth there to throw that many shoes. So that's a big project. And then you think about the money pit itself goes down like 150 feet, and it's all cribbed in like hand-hewn wood. And so building the road, digging the pit, hewing the wood, it takes years. It takes an army of people to do it. And this is the point I want to get to, is the island itself is it's very rare to actually find artifacts that substantiate that there were a lot of people living there. It's like they cleaned up after themselves. So you don't find a lot of broken pottery or left behind junk that you would if it was a bunch of pirates who were digging a hole and getting drunk and, burying it and running away and maybe coming back. It suggests discipline. It suggests people who were covering their tracks. And that, to me, suggests that it would be more likely a religious order, people abiding by a standard of making sure that they didn't leave any clues that would allow somebody to discover where they hid the treasure. They're in on it, rather than slaves or pirates, because those are the only other theories. British soldiers would be another one, but they find lots of evidence of British soldiers because they left stuff all over the place. But those were definitely not the people who built that road or who were running oxen on the island. So the question of why did they build stone roadways on Oak Island in a prehistoric situation and burn and hide a ship in an artificially created swamp is a really fascinating question, and I'm sure Sal curious about what the answer is.
Absolutely, it's all extremely fascinating, and thank you for that extremely detailed breakdown of it. I have a lot of questions and so forth, but was there anything else you wanted to cover first?
I want to make sure I get around to your family connection and the spiritual battle part. But are there any questions or anything I left hanging?
I mean, if you wanted to get through more, then I would suggest just continue, and we'll do the
okay.
And
Yeah. Okay, so I'll do this little part first. So this is your personal family connection to the Knights Templar and the Curse of Oak Island. This is a book called History of Lunenburg County, and it was published in 1896. And this I got from your grandmother, my mother. She has 2 copies of it. And this guy, M.B. de Brisset, is the authority cited throughout this book, The Curse of Oak Island by Randall Sullivan. And this guy also has a paragraph about your first ancestor in North America, Shogun. That's what I want to... I'm just going to put my phone down for a second and just oh yeah, here it is. Sorry. The family name is Knaut, Knaut, and there's this little entry here in the book which describes the arrival of your first ancestor in North America, Philip Augustus Knaut from Saxony, coming on the frigate Cunning, and he went on to become the sheriff. And so that was about 1750. And there's a museum or a historic house in Lunenburg, Nova Scotia, that bears that family name, Knaut. And that's my mother's name, so it's your grandmother's name. And she's actually the last generation that carries the name in North America, at least from our family line. So that is kind of where that is, my grandfather paddled his boat as a kid in 1895 around Oak Island. Like that's just what kids did back in that day. So, and then we covered in another podcast how he eventually went off to the First World War and was gassed in Europe, ended up having his lungs burned and moving to the prairies where eventually you were born. So there's kind of that one direct genealogical connection between yourself and the proximity to Oak Island, if you will. So if the Templar connection is true, then it's probably true for you as well. The last thing I'm going to say is there's this sense that, like in Raiders of the Lost Ark, that if you open the Ark of the Covenant, like there's some shit going to go down, right? And there are a couple of stories here that I wanted to mention that kind of speak to the spiritual energy. So let's imagine that the sacred relics were indeed spirited by the Knights Templar into Nova Scotia and hidden in this elaborate tunnel system in New Scotland, Nova Scotia, Canada. Then if there is any kind of like angelic, demonic, spiritual forces associated with the sacred relics, then they would be evident in proximity to them, right? If you came close to them, you're probably going to get like a of some kind. So I had two little examples of how that happens. Sorry, excuse my camera here. So one of them was this night watchman who was hired to look after the property just after 4 people had died there in a carbon monoxide accident. And he was a great big guy. His name was Jim Kaiser. And his job was to be night watchman on Oak Island in about, what year? In the 1960s, just after the 4 people had died. And one night, so Jim was this huge, tough guy, and everybody was scared of him. And then he was there as the night watchman, and he came back to his family, and he's like screaming his head off and swearing like crazy. And he said, this is a quote, "I had a little fire going. I put some wood on the fire, and then I lay down on the cot and closed my eyes. Apparently, he fell asleep." He said, "I woke up and I couldn't breathe. There were 2 of the biggest red eyes you would ever want to see looking right into his, and the whole body was covered with hair, tight and curly black hair." He said that was all he could see because whatever it was holding him down by the arms and had him pinned so tight he couldn't move, but then it smiled at him and said, "Don't ever come back." He said when he let it go and disappeared, the whole building shook, and it was unreal. And this huge man who had never been scared of anything ran home and never came back to the island. And he ends the story by saying, "My grandmother looked at me, and then she told me that when he came home that night, Jim showed him his arms, and they had huge bruises on them that had been made by handprints. So that's one of those kind of campfire spooky stories about like the curse of Oak Island. Okay, and then here's the modern one. There's a guy on the TV show named Dan Hensky, and he looks like he's kind of skinny and like an older guy. And he, this is a story from a friend of his. He said, Dan was in my kitchen when he lost it, Blankenship recalled. All of a sudden, it was like something took him over. He said, I had to kill you. I had to kill you. I said, who? What? He said, you lost the chest in the water. I had to kill you. He felt himself being possessed by the spirit of a slave who had worked underground on Oak Island. Hensky told me one of the other slaves had lost the chest in the water, so they chained him to a post. I knew they were going to torture him to death, so I cut his throat to let him die quickly. I saw and felt it all with perfect clarity. Then I blacked out. Hensky had been removed from Blankenship's home in a straitjacket and spent the next 2 weeks in a Halifax psychiatric ward. He returned to Oak Island to work once again along Blankenship, but struggled constantly with his fear that something truly dark lay buried beneath the ground he was digging in. Dan told me the entire time he was haunted by things that had been said to him. Now, I want to come back to a little later. Dan Hensky has a second nervous breakdown. And this is actually mentioned at the end of the previous podcast, Dan, because one of your friends asked about what about the guy who was naked on the beach, and I found the story. Okay, it's the same guy. Dan told me that one frigid February day at dusk, he had been stricken with the absolute certainty that evil spirits were about to erupt into the world out of the ground on Oak Island. He tried to escape by stripping off all his clothes and diving into the icy waters of Mahone Bay, then swimming to the shore wearing only a yellow hard hat. He was discovered the next day curled up naked on the floor of a mainland house, and once again he was removed to the psychiatric ward. One of the ways Dan Hensky had coped, stayed sane, it might be said, was by becoming increasingly religious. I decided that the best choice for me was to become a conduit for the Holy Spirit, he explained. As such, my means of praying would be to set aside other things in order to merge my individual spirit with the Holy Spirit. However it had happened, his practice had made Hensky into an extraordinarily kind, humble, and generous person. He had lived meagerly his entire life, yet he regularly gave money to an assortment of acquaintances who were worse off than he was. People could call Dan Hensky crazy if they wanted to, but what I knew for certain was that he was a good man. So that's where I thought I would bring it home, was just that kind of aspect, that the people who are there and who are hands-on in that environment recognize the spiritual energy, tension that's associated with it. And that seems to be, to me, to suggest that it is a place where sacred relics are housed, not lumps of gold and silver.
Wow. Well, thank you so much. That was an amazing of a lot of awesome information, and in particular, the last part really hit me on like a spiritual level. I felt like that was the Holy Spirit also speaking to me through what you said, because as you know, my name is also Dan. As you know, I've also had psychotic breaks like that, and I've become more religious. And what he said it there is like, I decided the best thing to do is become a conduit for the Holy Spirit, and that's exactly how I also believe that I'm called to try to do as well. So
yeah,
that was it's just really interesting to me how it all ties together, like all the symbolism of the Round Table, King Arthur, the Knights of the Round Table, and then this server, the Temple Mount, the Knights Templar, the Phoenicians, Melchizedek, this, and then that. Like, it's hard to put it all to words, but it seems like it's all this weird mystery play or something.
Yeah.
But that was very, very good, interesting presentation on the Oak Island. Was there anything else you want to say, or should we open it up for questions now?
No, let's open it up. I'm feeling like I said what I wanted to say. I hope it came across.
Very well, yeah. Thank you. That's great. And again, I hope you guys will also listen to the first episodes on the Knights Templar and this one and the first episode on Oak Island. They all kind of tie together. But does anyone have a question or a comment for Hawthorne?
I have a few questions.
Go ahead.
Well, one, Hawthorne, I would just want to hear your opinion on this. I had heard a theory, right, because I had researched the Templars in France, right, the history of it. When the Templars had left France and they were excommunicated, right, apparently their vault was empty when the King of France raided it. Do you think what was in their vault and like their big stronghold in France was brought to Oak Island?
Well, okay, let's just think this through, right? They're a wealthy paramilitary organization. I believe they would have been tipped off at some level, because all of this had to be done, through, paper and couriers. With days of, you couldn't do it like by sending everybody an email. So then I think they would have had a survival strategy, both for themselves as an organization and for their most sacred possessions. They were meticulous record keepers, but all of their records were burned by the King of France, who owed them the money that led him to excommunicate them. So, of course, you burn the records. That makes sense. But that's why the meticulous record keepers who were the Templars, we don't have any of their records because the king burned them, seized them and burned them. But they would have gotten away with their very best shit. And, think about it. Bankers know how to get their will done. They use money to do it. So you hire experts, you hire some ships, and you facilitate the movement of your most precious goods out of harm's way. And then one of the themes that's explored in the History Channel TV show is the fact that the Knights Templar seem to have a historical progression into the Freemasonry movement that we know today, and that the searchers for the Oak Island treasure since 1795 have been overwhelmingly Freemasons. So it seems like the Templars planted the treasure and the Freemasons are looking for it, if you will. That makes sense. But it does suggest that there's some knowledge exchange, that they have some inside knowledge that inclines Freemasons to invest their life savings. And many of them blow their brains out, financially at least, in the pursuit of the treasure, the recovery of a treasure that, and I said this in the last recording, and it's absolutely still true. Since I was 9 years old, I've been wondering the same two questions, and they're still unanswered. Who did it? And what were they going to such incredible efforts to hide? And I think it was the Knights Templar. And that's a pretty stunning thing to admit, because if that's the case, then it means that what's down there in Oak Island is actually of global religious significance and spiritual significance. I can't find any plausible explanation for another reason for such an extravagant investment of resources in hiding something that anywhere else you'd kind of stick it in the back of a cave. And so that's a humbling realization, but I'm really curious to see the final proof.
That's really amazing when you think about it, because I agree with you. I think that's the best explanation. said, it doesn't make sense. Like you said as well, it doesn't make sense if it was just quote unquote treasure or wealth, because if it's wealth, you want to have some access to it, convenient access. So it seems like whatever they buried was intended essentially never to be found, or only to be found in latter days or something. But that's pretty crazy. And I mean, they did say they found the Spear of Destiny and stuff like that. So
one of the things they found this year is called an adze, A-D-Z-E, and an adze is like an axe, but the blade goes sideways instead of up and down, and you use an adze to turn a log into a board. So you got a round log that you cut down with your axe, and then you take your adze and you scrape off both sides. And you go down one side, and then you turn it over, and you go down the other side, and at the end of a couple of days, you got one log, right? Or one board. Well, that's how they had to make every board in a 8x8 shaft to go down 120 feet on Oak Island in order to build a chamber down there that seems to be covered in concrete and metal, in a complex that includes booby-trapped tunnels that didn't kill them in the process. Like, the engineering complexity of it is like the number of hours it takes, like man hours, human hours of labor to do that, is shocking. And then, like, nobody has any historical record of it, so it was hidden. There's no left behinds that suggest that there was a major community here. No garbage, no infrastructure, no buildings, just the roads and the ox shoes. And actually more of an appearance like the people who did it were cleaning up after themselves. And I'm emphasizing that because it's not something that I've heard in any of the online narrative. But it's like, if it was a bunch of British sailors or soldiers or, God forbid, pirates, the whole place would have looked like a junkyard. And these guys are going around with, they're going around there with little shovels and sifters and metal detectors, and they're finding very little left behind. And it really does give the appearance of a disciplined society of people who were determined to clean up after themselves, hide all evidence of what they were doing, and make sure that the infidels never discovered what the intent of their efforts was all about. It was all about hiding something. And they did a damn good job of it.
Yeah. I personally had saw it myself. Even my background, being accountant in Scottish, and
you were roboting for me anyway. Couldn't hear you.
Yeah, me too. I couldn't hear that.
Oh,
again.
No, we can't hear you. Try to leave recycling your Wi-Fi or whatever. Does anyone else have a question though while he fixes his connection?
Yeah, I got a question.
Go ahead, bro.
Do you believe there may be any type of like esoteric understanding and unraveling some of the spiritual sides to the secrets where the treasure lies, or do you believe that there may be some type of esoteric understanding that could be found in the Rosslyn Chapel that may hint to something about the treasure?
Yes, generally, I believe that the people who hid it would have preserved the knowledge of how it would be recovered somehow and somewhere. But I haven't seen anything convincing that tells me that, like, here's the treasure map. On the History Channel show, there's a map of Oak Island that is described as a Templar map, recovered by a woman named Zena Halpern. And you can Google that one. It's quite a fascinating map. It's all written in French, and it shows a number of fixtures on the island. The island very much resembles Oak Island. It's quite convincing in that respect. they just haven't found anything that is indicated on that map that pinpoints it as a legitimate representation of what was going on there. So it's one of those dangling storylines that to me is still inconclusive, but I would completely agree that the people who went to the incredible work of doing this would not have allowed the knowledge of its construction to be lost. That is what you'd want to do, is make sure that anyone who's not authorized to go in there, right, is going to trigger the flood tunnel system and get washed out and never recover the treasure. But if you do have the magic formula on how to approach it, then you could in fact recover it. That's what I would think. So I'm just plugging in my phone.
So something that stuck out to me always would be the fact that the types of individuals that did this, and just to ram home your original point, in fact, that realistically it would have been strewn with the works of, obviously, of the massive undertaking that it would have taken to have done this. And I have looked into this quite a lot myself, and quite incredible when we think about it. It doesn't seem like much in today's modern day. But even today, if you were to do this using modern equipment, it would really leave a scattering. And yeah, it's true. And I would really like that people would look into it in this sort of a sense. So the Melchizedek came up, and I changed my name instantly to that, and I also changed my picture to the cross and come off camera so that people could see that cross. And the reason that I did that was because when we think about Revelation and what it means to be a Melchizedek, and to be a Melchizedek is not just to be a king and a priest, of your own household, but just a king and a priest in the context, biblically speaking, and what that means. And what that really means to me is that maybe it is a king and a priest of the household, maybe the household of the body, that would be the people to find out what this message means. So a map therein, let's say, was strewn out and found by somebody, I don't necessarily see it being that way. I see it more that like that is already in existence and has been for a very long time. Maybe in a book like Revelation, and it would be of revelation to the person that, let's say, would hear it, and it would make sense. Relevant to maybe a line of people, maybe like yourselves, and that's why you're looking into it. Relevant to a line of people, and because of that relevance to those people, and because of their, I guess, fervent want toward this knowledge, that eventually you would maybe see that there are secrets, or maybe even a map per se, hidden within inside of the very thing that these types of Melchizedekian people would look into. That being the Bible itself. So yeah, that was sort of my take.
That's fascinating. I mean, I was listening to a documentary about Melchizedek, and we got to do a whole separate podcast on Melchizedek. So let's do that soon. And but yeah, it's all so crazy how it all ties together. And maybe because again, in the Knights of the Round Table, they were questing for the Holy Grail, and Melchizedek, in his depictions, he's depicted with a grail and bread, which is trippy because that's like the communion of bread and wine, but it goes all the way back to Genesis. Then you got the Holy Grail that the Knights of the Round Table had, but that was the real Holy Grail that caught the blood of Christ. The Spear of Destiny, well, that was found under the Temple Mount by the Knights Templar. So they had the Spear of Destiny, supposedly. Could they have also had the Grail? Who else would have found it, right? They were the ones crusading through Jerusalem. They were the ones who would have found at least what they believed was it, right? It might not have actually been the real thing, but they might have believed it was. And then they would add the motivation, the money, the discipline, the time, the reason to conceal such under the authority of the Catholic Church, who we know has a secret underground libraries, right? So it's in their MO, because they would have been part of the Catholic Church when they did this, to hide this kind of stuff.
And the theory, like that strand, would basically suggest that the pit and the infrastructure were put in place before they were excommunicated
Yeah.
because it was years of work to do it, right?
Oh yeah. It'd be
But
hard to do on
they
your
had
own.
their own intelligence council, and they would have said, fuck, the King of France might just turn on us. What are we going to do then? Well, let's send some people over to Nova Scotia and dig a big hole. And the hole was prepared. That's how you would build a road. And like, you think about it, how did oxen get to this island in Nova Scotia? Well, they came on ships. They came on the ships of people who had a plan that included building a road and running oxen. You have to bring them all hay too, because there's no hay on the island, right? So the logistics, like the supply chain, to be running an oxen cart road system on an island in Nova Scotia, all that had to come from Europe. The ox shoes, the technology, the food, and I think the labor, unless it was slave labor from like the South, but I don't think it was. I think it was all done by Europeans. I don't think it was done by Mesoamericans.
The ox being the aleph, meaning the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet. It is also said all the time that the story of Messiah, story of the very Bible itself, is hidden in the aleph tav, or the aleph beit, the alphabet. Okay, the aleph beit, the aleph being the ox head, being the ultimate resh, meaning crown. Okay, and then obviously the tav would be the Z. And in that there is a pictographic conjoining, and the story of Messiah is hidden within inside of this. And not only is the story of Messiah hidden inside of this, it sounds like there are many elements within what you're talking about that are also in this too. And this is sort of more what I mean by maybe they used a pre-existing sort of, I guess, codex that was already existing within inside of here. The fact that they even used oxen and the things that were left. Remember, they were meticulous to not leave. But the fact that they left ox shoes, that is, I believe, maybe important. I believe that may be important. And then when you were speaking, Shogun, something that stuck out to me, you were talking about the Melchizedek spear and the bread. And obviously we know of the water pit, right? That maybe changing the consistency therein of what the water is itself. And I don't know if anyone's ever tried that, changing the consistency of what the water is, and some form of buoyancy of some like. I'm not entirely sure if that makes any sense to any of you, but if you were to change the consistency to something of that of bread, not bread itself, but dough, and how that would maybe change that portion of the island, and maybe toy around with those sorts of ideas. Anything at this point to go, but I sort of am with you on that, Shogun, that there would probably be some form of a way to get to, is obvious that they would know to not have to go past all these booby traps. But then maybe these booby traps are part of the mechanism to remove the. It's just you have to have the secret ingredient, like the secret ingredient to rise in bread.
So let me weigh in on that one for a minute, because one thing we didn't talk about today is the fact that they found human bones at a depth of 130 feet. 2 different bone samples, and they had them genetically tested and dated, and they were both medieval, and one was European and the other was Middle Eastern. So you have to ask yourself, how do human bones with that genetic heritage end up 140 feet down in a hole in Nova Scotia in an interval when Europeans and Middle Eastern people were not, according to our narrative, here? How did they get down that hole? And that is like just one of those really weird facts that has to be dealt with in trying to make sense of the whole narrative. Like, was it dug by slaves and they killed them all and left them all down there, thinking they'd never be found? I don't know, but I don't know how human bones could possibly come up in it's what they call the spoils, right? They run these big shafts down and they bring everything up that's within the shaft, and they call that the spoils. And then they go through it all by hand and they look for stuff, and they found these 2 bone fragments, and they were human. And that's just one of those facts, like the lead cross on the beach, that you have to find a way to make sense of in order to figure out what the hell actually happened here. But there were definitely dead people left at the bottom of the pit, and they were not North American genetically.
You'd imagine doing that kind of work would be dangerous, and in the course of that kind of an excavation, you might have a few people die. But you're right; it's intriguing to think about who they were and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the questions I have is is there anything else equivalent to this anywhere in the world? And I think the answer is no. I don't think there's anything else quite like this. But I'm wondering, is there anything else like this where someone went to this kind of lengths to hide or trap something in ancient times? I'm not aware of any. And then the other question is, were they ever intending to get it back, or were they hiding it sort of for all time? That's the other question I have. Was it set up so they could come back and retrieve it? Or was it set up in the sense of let no one ever find this, basically? Probably it was to go back and get it. That seems more likely.
I think it would be. There is a treasure map, the one that's attributed to Zena Halpern, that was allegedly found hidden within the leather cover of an ancient book. And it has a French script that describes features on an island that looks like Oak Island. That's the kind of thing that I would have expected. So whether that specific document or not is authentic could be a separate question. But that's what I would expect that the people would have made. If you go to all this trouble to booby trap something, to hide something sacred, you would make provision for a means by which it could be retrieved without you getting killed, right?
Right, so that's why I think without modern technology, re-excavating what they buried there would be even more labor-intensive than burying it in the first place, or maybe not. Maybe it wouldn't be highly labor-intensive. So I'm wondering, was there a back door? Is there a way to bypass all that? Because it seems weird
Yes.
to do all that manually.
That's what I mean. Even if you think about, you can think about digging a hole, but think about digging a hole when you're going down 10 feet, 20 feet, 30 feet, 40 feet, 50 feet. And you're doing all this manually, right, with buckets and a shovel. And you really got to be motivated. And it seems to me that there had to be a sense of purpose attached to people going to such extremes to create this ultra complex protective infrastructure. And given the level of thought, consciousness required to design it and motivate people to execute the design and resource them, right, so they don't starve to death or turn around and kill their masters. That seems to me to be more the qualities that you would associate with a spiritual brotherhood than, as I've said a couple of times in this conversation, pirates or buccaneers or soldiers. And I think those are the only other candidates.
I think it's pretty compelling. Fantastic. Well, that was really very interesting, and I feel like we've reached a pretty good conclusion. But does anyone else have any questions or comments they wanted to ask or make? Okay. Was there anything else you wanted to say on the subject before we close the podcast, Hawthorne?
Well, just personally, thank you for the invitation to come back and do this. Also, to say to you that your personal warrior lineage goes back to my grandfather, your great grandfather, Wilfred Laurier Connaught, who was born and raised in Mahone Bay, Nova Scotia, where when he got in his rowboat and paddled around, he would have visited Oak Island. And he went into the First War and came back a war veteran, scarred by the experience. And that's affected kind of my generation and your generation. Also, I'll just observe that both my father and my grandfather actually wore uniforms and carried guns, at least in training. And yet your generation and my generation haven't had to carry that responsibility. And that makes a big difference to our kind of quality of life and experience. And I hope that remains true. So just a couple of thoughts about how I think this whole narrative connects you to your Templar roots, if you will.
Thank you. That's very interesting, and I really appreciate all the information and your time. And thanks so much for coming on the show again. And hopefully, we'll have you on the Temple Mount podcast more in the future and talk about other things as well. But I really appreciate it. So thank you so much, Hawthorne, and thank you to everybody who attended and participated. Also, this was great. And God bless. Join the Temple Mount Discord server. Keep an eye on announcements. We'll be doing great events every day, and we got a few cool ones coming up in the next 2 days. So like, follow, and subscribe, YouTube, BitChute, and SoundCloud. You can find all the links at the top of the server. Thanks again, Dad, and thanks, everybody.
Love you, son. Thanks for the time.
God bless. And let's jump to Templar Tavern, please. See you guys down there.